Welcome, dear listener, to a peaceful journey through time, where we shall walk the quiet corridors of learning and discover the gentle rhythms of scholarly life in medieval times. Let us settle into this tale as the evening light fades, and allow ourselves to drift into the calm world of Brother Thomas and his fellow scribes at St. Aldrich's Abbey, nestled in the rolling hills of 12th century England. The soft chiming of the monastery bell drifted across the misty valley, its bronze voice calling the brothers to lauds as the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern hills. In the scriptorium of St. Aldrich's Abbey, Brother Thomas slowly opened his eyes, having already been awake for some time, listening to the gentle sounds of the awakening day. At 35 years of age, he had spent more than half his life within these peaceful walls, and the rhythm of monastic life had become as natural to him as breathing. The scriptorium where Thomas worked was a long, rectangular chamber on the second floor of the Abbey's main building, with tall windows facing east to catch the morning light. 20 wooden desks were arranged in neat rows, each equipped with the tools of the scribe's trade: quills cut from goose feathers, small pots of black and colored inks, pumice stones for smoothing parchment, and sharp knives for scraping away mistakes. The room smelled pleasantly of parchment, ink, and the beeswax candles that provided additional light during the darker hours of winter. Thomas rose from his narrow bed in the dormitory and joined his brothers for the morning prayers. The Abbey church was dimly lit by candles, their warm glow reflecting off the simple stone walls and wooden ceiling beams. The voices of the monks rose and fell in ancient melodies that had been sung in this place for over 200 years, creating a sense of continuity and peace that settled over the community like a comfortable blanket. After prayers came the first meal of the day, taken in silence while one of the brothers read aloud from the lives of the saints. The food was simple but nourishing: thick porridge made from oats grown in the Abbey's fields, fresh bread baked that morning in the monastery ovens, and honey from the beehives that Brother Benedict tended with such gentle care. Thomas ate slowly, savoring both the food and the peaceful atmosphere of the refectory, where sunlight streamed through high windows and dust motes danced in the golden air. Following breakfast, the scribes made their way to the scriptorium for the beginning of their daily work. Thomas paused at the doorway, as he did every morning, to appreciate the sight of the room where he spent most of his waking hours. The long wooden tables gleamed with years of careful polishing, and the shelves along the walls held hundreds of volumes, completed manuscripts waiting to be bound, reference works consulted during copying, and the precious exemplars from which new copies would be made. The work of the scriptorium was overseen by Brother Marcus, an elderly monk whose hair had long since turned white but whose eyes remained sharp and keen. Brother Marcus had been a scribe for over 40 years, and his knowledge of manuscripts, inks, and parchment was legendary throughout the region. He moved slowly between the desks each morning, checking on the progress of various projects, offering gentle guidance, and ensuring that the highest standards of accuracy and beauty were maintained in every piece of work. Thomas settled at his assigned desk, the third from the left in the second row, a position he had occupied for the past 8 years. The desktop was worn smooth by countless hours of use, marked here and there with tiny ink stains that had become as familiar to him as old friends. His current project lay before him: a copy of St. Augustine's Confessions, written in the clear, elegant script that had taken him years to perfect. The parchment was made from sheepskin that had been carefully prepared by Brother William in the Abbey's parchment workshop. The skins were soaked in lime water for weeks to remove the hair and flesh, then stretched on wooden frames and scraped smooth with curved knives. The finished parchment was soft and white, with a slight texture that made it pleasant to write upon. Each sheet represented hours of patient work, and Thomas treated every piece with the reverence it deserved. Before beginning to write, Thomas prepared his materials with the methodical care that had become second nature. He selected 3 quills from his collection, each cut to a slightly different width for different types of lettering. The quills came from geese raised in the Abbey's farmyard, and Thomas had learned to choose the best feathers from the left wing, which curved naturally to fit a right-handed writer's grip. The ink was made according to a recipe that had been used at St. Aldrich's for generations. Oak gallnuts were crushed and mixed with iron sulfate and gum arabic, creating a rich black liquid that would darken over time and remain legible for centuries. For special decorative work, Thomas also had access to colored inks, red made from cinnabar, blue from lapis lazuli, and gold from actual gold leaf mixed with honey and egg white. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating Thomas's work surface with a soft, even glow. He positioned his parchment carefully, using a straight edge to ensure that his lines would be perfectly horizontal. With practiced movements, he dipped his quill into the ink, tapped off the excess, and began to write. The words flowed from his pen in the beautiful script known as Caroline minuscule, a style of writing that had been developed during the reign of Charlemagne and had become the standard for scholarly manuscripts throughout Europe. Each letter was formed with careful attention to proportion and spacing, creating text that was both beautiful and highly legible. Thomas wrote slowly and deliberately, pausing frequently to check his exemplar and ensure that he was copying the text accurately. The work required intense concentration, but Thomas found it deeply satisfying. There was something meditative about the process of forming each letter, of seeing words and sentences take shape beneath his pen, of participating in the ancient tradition of preserving and transmitting human knowledge. The scriptorium was quiet except for the soft scratching of quills on parchment and the occasional rustle of pages being turned on as the morning progressed. Thomas became absorbed in the text he was copying. St. Augustine's words seemed to flow through his mind and heart as he wrote them, and he often found himself pausing to reflect on their meaning. The work of a scribe was not merely mechanical copying. It required understanding and engagement with the text, ensuring that the wisdom of the ages was preserved not just in letter but in spirit. The autumn air that drifted through the open windows carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from the kitchens. Outside, Thomas could hear the distant sounds of abbey life. Brother Benedict calling to his bees, the rhythmic thud of Brother Peter's hammer in the blacksmith shop, and the gentle lowing of cattle in the fields. These familiar sounds created a peaceful backdrop that helped Thomas maintain his focus while providing a comforting reminder of the larger community, of which he was a part. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting longer rectangles of golden light across the scriptorium floor, Brother Thomas reached a chapter break in his copying of St. Augustine's Confessions. This was the moment he had been anticipating, the creation of an illuminated capital letter that would mark the beginning of a new section. The art of illumination was Thomas's particular specialty, and he approached it with the same careful preparation and deep reverence that characterized all his work. Setting aside his regular quill, Thomas opened a wooden box that contained his finest brushes, made from the whiskers of martens and the tail hairs of squirrels. These delicate tools were necessary for the intricate work of illumination, allowing him to apply paint in precise lines and subtle gradations of color. He also retrieved small ceramic pots containing his most precious materials, ultramarine blue made from ground lapis lazuli that had traveled along ancient trade routes from distant Afghanistan, vermilion red created from cinnabar, and sheets of gold leaf so thin they seemed to float on the slightest breath of air. The letter he would create was a capital I that would begin the phrase in principio, marking the start of a new chapter in Augustine's spiritual journey. Thomas had sketched the basic design the previous evening, drawing inspiration from a pattern book that contained hundreds of decorative motifs collected from manuscripts throughout Europe. The letter would be rendered in blue and gold, with delicate vine scrolls extending from its main stem and tiny flowers blooming along its length. Thomas began by mixing his colors, a process that required both scientific precision and artistic intuition. The ultramarine blue was ground to an extremely fine powder and mixed with egg tempera, creating a paint that would remain brilliant for centuries without fading. The consistency had to be perfect. Too thick and the paint would not flow smoothly from the brush. Too thin and the color would lack intensity and coverage. The gold leaf required even more delicate handling. Thomas cut tiny pieces from the larger sheets, using a special knife that was kept scrupulously clean to prevent any contamination. The gold would be applied over a base of red bull, a clay-based preparation that would make the finished gilding gleam like polished metal. This technique, learned from Byzantine craftsmen, created an effect of luminous beauty that seemed to make the letters glow with their own inner light dot. As Thomas worked on his illumination, he was joined at his table by Brother Francis, a younger monk who was learning the art of manuscript decoration. Francis was 22 years old and had been at the abbey for only 3 years, but he showed remarkable talent for the delicate work of illumination. Thomas enjoyed teaching the younger monk, finding that explaining techniques and principles helped deepen his own understanding of the craft. "Watch carefully," Thomas said softly, demonstrating how to hold the brush for maximum control. "The secret is to let the brush do the work. Don't force it, but guide it gently, like leading a horse with a light touch on the reins." Francis nodded eagerly, his young face serious with concentration. He had been practicing basic letter forms for months, and Thomas judged that he was nearly ready to attempt his first true illumination. The progression from novice to master was a slow one, requiring not just technical skill, but also the development of artistic sensitivity and deep understanding of the spiritual significance of the work. The morning passed peacefully as Thomas worked on his illumination and guided Francis through exercises in color mixing and brush control. The scriptorium remained quiet, disturbed only by the soft sounds of scholarly work, the turning of pages, the gentle scratch of quills, and the whispered consultations between scribes and their assistants. Brother Marcus made his rounds, pausing at each desk to check progress and offer encouragement, his experienced eye catching even the smallest errors or inconsistencies dotted the desk beside Thomas. Brother David was working on a copy of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, his neat handwriting flowing across the parchment in steady lines. David was known for his exceptionally clear and regular script, and his manuscripts were prized by scholars throughout the region. He worked with quiet intensity, occasionally pausing to consult his exemplar or to sharpen his quill with quick, practiced strokes of his knife. Brother Stephen, seated across the aisle, was engaged in the challenging task of copying a musical manuscript, carefully noting not just the words of the hymns but also the neumes that indicated their melodies. This work required knowledge of both Latin grammar and musical notation, and Stephen's training as a cantor served him well in ensuring that the musical markings were accurate and clear. The variety of work-taking place in the scriptorium reflected the abbey's role as a center of learning and culture. In addition to religious texts, the scribes copied works of history, philosophy, medicine, and natural science. They preserved the wisdom of ancient Rome and Greece, while also recording the thoughts and discoveries of contemporary scholars. Each manuscript represented not just individual effort, but the collective dedication of the monastic community to preserving and transmitting human knowledge. As the bell tower chimed the hour of terce, marking the end of the morning work period, Thomas carefully cleaned his brushes and covered his paints to prevent them from drying out. His illuminated capital was nearly complete, lacking only a few final touches of gold leaf that would be applied once the underlying paint had fully dried. The letter was a thing of beauty, its intricate decoration serving not merely as ornamentation, but as a visual prayer, a way of honoring the sacred text through artistic excellence. The monks filed out of the scriptorium for the brief prayer service of terce, their footsteps echoing softly in the stone corridors of the abbey. Thomas paused at the window, looking out over the abbey gardens, where Brother Paul was tending the herb beds that provided medicines for the infirmary and flavoring for the kitchen. The gardens were laid out in neat geometric patterns, with gravel paths separating beds of sage, thyme, rosemary, and other useful plants. The sight of the carefully tended gardens reminded Thomas of the orderly beauty he strove to create in his manuscripts, each element carefully planned and lovingly executed, following the midday prayers and meal. The afternoon hours at St. Aldrich's Abbey were dedicated to study and contemplation. While some of the scribes returned to their copying work, others engaged in the scholarly pursuits that were equally important to the monastery's mission. Brother Thomas, having completed his morning's illumination work, spent these hours in the Abbey library, engaged in research for a commentary on the Psalms that he was preparing. The Library of St. Aldrich's was the pride of the community, containing over 800 volumes collected over 2 centuries of careful acquisition and copying. The room was housed in a specially constructed stone building, designed to protect the precious manuscripts from fire and dampness. Tall wooden shelves lined the walls, each equipped with slanted reading desks where manuscripts could be consulted safely. Iron chains secured the most valuable books to the shelves, ensuring that these irreplaceable texts could not be removed from the library without authorization. Thomas made his way to a reading desk positioned near one of the tall windows, where the afternoon light would be sufficient for close study. He had requested several volumes from Brother Anselm, the librarian, including Jerome's commentaries on the Psalms, Augustine's discussions of Hebrew poetry, and a recently acquired copy of a work by the Spanish scholar Isidore of Seville that contained insights into the historical background of the Samic texts. The process of scholarly research in the 12th century was a careful and methodical endeavor. Thomas began by reading through each text slowly, making notes on a wax tablet that could be erased and reused. When he found passages that were particularly relevant to his commentary, he copied them onto small pieces of parchment, carefully noting the source and location of each quotation. This meticulous approach ensured that his own work would be accurately footnoted and properly attributed. As Thomas worked, he was joined by Brother Edmund, a monk who had come to St. Aldrich's after studying at the cathedral school in Paris. Edmund was working on a treatise about the proper calculation of Easter, a complex mathematical problem that required knowledge of astronomy, calendar systems, and ecclesiastical law. The two scholars often consulted with each other, finding that their different areas of expertise complemented each other well. "Thomas," Edmund said quietly, settling at the reading desk beside his friend, "I wonder if you might help me with a question about lunar calculations. Your knowledge of ancient sources might shed light on a problem I'm encountering." Thomas looked up from his manuscript, always willing to assist a fellow scholar. "Of course, Edmund. What difficulty are you facing?" Edmund opened his own manuscript, pointing to a column of figures covered with erasures and corrections. "I'm trying to reconcile the Roman calendar system with the Hebrew lunar months, but the ancient sources give conflicting information about the length of the lunar cycle. Some say 29 days, others say 30, and a few suggest something in between." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. This was exactly the kind of scholarly problem that the monastery's library was designed to help solve. "Let me consult Bede's On the Reckoning of Time," he suggested. "I remember that he addresses this very question, and his calculations have proven remarkably accurate." The two monks spent the next hour working together, consulting various astronomical texts and comparing different methods of calculation. This kind of collaborative scholarship was one of the great pleasures of monastic life, allowing learned men to pool their knowledge in pursuit of greater understanding. The Abbey's emphasis on learning meant that such discussions were encouraged and valued as much as individual study. As they worked, other scholars came and went in the library, each pursuing his own research interests. Brother Matthew was studying medical texts, preparing remedies for the abbey's infirmary. Brother Luke was working on a history of the local region, consulting charters and chronicles that recorded the deeds of kings and bishops. Brother Jonathan was engaged in the complex task of translating a Greek theological text into Latin, a project that required not only linguistic skill, but also deep understanding of doctrinal subtleties. The atmosphere in the library was one of quiet concentration and mutual respect. Scholars would whisper brief consultations with each other, but for the most part, the room was filled with the peaceful sounds of learning, pages turning, quills scratching on parchment, and the soft rustle of manuscripts being opened and closed. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows created a golden ambience that made even the most difficult texts seem somehow more accessible and inviting. Thomas's research progressed steadily as he gathered material for his commentary. He found himself particularly drawn to the way different scholars had interpreted the same psalmic verses, noting how their understanding had been shaped by their historical contexts and personal experiences. Augustine's interpretations, written during the declining years of the Roman Empire, emphasized themes of divine providence and eternal stability. Jerome's work, produced during his years in Bethlehem, showed deep appreciation for the Hebrew origins of the texts. Later commentators had added their own insights, creating a rich tradition of scholarly interpretation that Thomas hoped to contribute to with his own work. The task of writing a commentary was not merely academic but deeply spiritual. Thomas approached each psalm as both a scholar and a monk, seeking to understand not only the historical and linguistic aspects of the text, but also its meaning for contemporary Christian life. He found that the act of research itself was a form of prayer, a way of entering more deeply into the wisdom that had been passed down through generations of faithful believers. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas became absorbed in a particularly fascinating passage from Augustine's expositions on the Psalms. The great theologian was discussing the relationship between earthly and heavenly music, suggesting that the rhythms and melodies of human song were pale reflections of the perfect harmony that existed in the divine realm. This concept resonated deeply with Thomas, who had always been moved by the connection between artistic beauty and spiritual truth. The idea led Thomas to consider his own work as an illuminator. Just as the Psalms used earthly images to point toward heavenly realities, perhaps his decorative letters and painted borders served a similar function, using material beauty to direct the mind toward spiritual truth. The gold leaf that caught and reflected light might be seen as an image of divine illumination, while the intricate patterns of vines and flowers could represent the abundant life that flowed from God's creative power. These contemplations were interrupted by the soft chiming of the bell for Vespers, the evening prayer service. Thomas carefully marked his place in the manuscript he was reading and returned it to Brother Anselm for safe storage. His research tablets, filled with notes and quotations, he carried back to his desk in the scriptorium, where they would guide his writing in the days to come. Chapter 4. The Evening Hours. The evening hours at St. Aldrich's Abbey were perhaps the most peaceful time of day, when the community gathered for the final prayers and then settled into quiet activities that prepared both body and spirit for rest. After Vespers, the monks had a light supper of bread, cheese, and ale, eaten once again in contemplative silence while one of the brothers read from the works of the Desert Fathers, those early monks whose wisdom continued to guide monastic life centuries after their deaths. Thomas particularly enjoyed these evening readings, finding in the simple stories of the desert monks a refreshing counterpoint to the complex theological texts that occupied his scholarly work. The tales of Anthony and Pachomius, of their struggles with temptation and their growth in holiness, reminded him of the ultimate purpose that lay behind all the community's learning and artistic endeavors: the cultivation of souls that could serve God with pure hearts and clear minds. Following supper, The monks were free to pursue individual activities during the hour before Compline, the final prayer service of the day. Some chose to walk in the abbey gardens, enjoying the cool evening air and the peaceful transition from day to night. Others remained in the scriptorium, working on personal projects or catching up on correspondence with scholars at other monasteries. Thomas usually spent this time in what he thought of as gentle work, tasks that required skill and attention but were less demanding than his morning copying and illumination. This evening, Thomas decided to work on preparing parchment for future projects. The process of preparing writing surfaces was an art in itself, requiring patience and careful attention to detail. Thomas began with sheets of parchment that had already been through the initial stages of preparation, but needed final smoothing and sizing before they would be ready for writing. He spread a sheet of parchment on his desk and examined it carefully, feeling the surface with his fingertips to detect any rough spots or imperfections. Using a piece of fine pumice stone, he gently abraded any areas that felt uneven, working with circular motions until the entire surface was uniformly smooth. This work required a delicate touch. Too much pressure would thin the parchment dangerously, while too little would leave rough spots that would cause the quill to catch and spatter ink. After smoothing, Thomas applied a light coating of chalk mixed with finely ground bone, rubbing it into the parchment with a soft cloth. This sizing would prevent the ink from spreading when applied, ensuring that letters remained crisp and clear. The prepared parchment was then set aside to dry completely before being stored in wooden chests that protected it from humidity and insects. As Thomas worked, Brother Francis joined him, bringing his own sheets of parchment to prepare. The young monk had been practicing this skill for several months and was becoming quite proficient, though he still sought Thomas's guidance on the finer points of the craft. "How can you tell when the surface is smooth enough?" Francis asked, running his fingers across a sheet he had been working on. Thomas smiled, remembering when he had asked Brother Marcus the same question years earlier. "Feel this," he said, guiding Francis's hand across a properly prepared sheet. "Notice how your fingers glide without catching. That's what you're aiming for. But also look at how the light reflects off the surface. It should be even, without bright spots or dull areas that indicate irregularities." The two monks worked quietly together, their hands moving in the practiced rhythms of their craft. The scriptorium was peaceful in the evening light, with only a few other monks pursuing similar quiet activities. Brother Stephen was mending a torn page in an old manuscript, carefully matching fibers and applying a thin coat of starch-based adhesive. Brother David was sharpening a collection of quills, testing each one on a practice sheet to ensure that it made clean, consistent lines. The evening light filtering through the tall windows grew gradually dimmer as the sun sank toward the western hills. Thomas paused in his work to light a candle, its warm glow creating a small circle of light around his desk. The familiar smell of beeswax mingled with the sense of parchment and ink that always filled the scriptorium, creating an atmosphere that Thomas found deeply comforting and conducive to peaceful work. As he continued preparing parchment, Thomas found his mind turning to the day's accomplishments and the work that lay ahead. His illuminated capital letter was nearly complete and would be ready for the final touches of gold leaf tomorrow morning. His research for the Psalm commentary had yielded several promising leads that would need to be pursued in the coming days. The steady progress on his copy of Augustine's Confessions meant that he would finish that project within the next few weeks, freeing him to begin work on a new manuscript. The rhythm of monastic life, with its alternation between prayer, work, and study, created a sense of purpose and continuity that Thomas found deeply satisfying. Each day brought its own challenges and rewards, but all were part of a larger pattern of service to God and the preservation of human learning. The work of the scriptorium might seem slow and painstaking to those accustomed to the bustle of the outside world, but Thomas knew that the manuscripts they created would outlast kingdoms and preserve wisdom for generations yet unborn. The soft chiming of the bell for Compline brought the day's work to a gentle close. Thomas carefully cleaned his tools and stored the prepared parchment in its protective chest. As he joined his brothers in the procession to the chapel, he felt the deep satisfaction that came from a day well spent in useful labor and scholarly pursuit. Chapter 5. The Master's Workshop as autumn deepened into winter. The daily rhythm of life at St. Aldrich's Abbey took on a more intimate character. The scriptorium was warmed by braziers filled with glowing charcoal, their gentle heat making the long hours of detailed work more comfortable for hands that held delicate quills and brushes. The shorter days meant that more work was done by candlelight, creating pools of warm, golden illumination around each desk where the scribes pursued their careful craft. Brother Thomas had been invited by Brother Marcus, the master of the scriptorium, to assist with a particularly important commission that had come to the abbey from the bishop of the neighboring diocese. The bishop had requested a deluxe copy of the Gospels, to be written on the finest vellum and decorated with illuminations of exceptional beauty and complexity. This was the kind of project that would enhance the abbey's reputation throughout the region and bring both spiritual and material benefits to the community. The preparation for such a prestigious manuscript required careful planning and coordination. Brother Marcus had assigned different aspects of the work to various members of the scriptorium, based on their particular strengths and specialties. The text would be copied by Brother David, whose handwriting was renowned for its clarity and consistency. The major illuminations would be created by Brother Marcus himself, drawing on his decades of experience with the most challenging decorative work. Thomas had been chosen to create the smaller decorative elements, initial letters, border decorations, and marginal ornaments that would complement the major illuminations. The first step in the project was the selection and preparation of materials. For a manuscript of this importance, only the finest vellum would be acceptable. Parchment made from the skins of very young calves, resulting in a writing surface that was both exceptionally smooth and remarkably durable. Brother William, the abbey's parchment maker, had been preparing these special sheets for months, carefully selecting the best skins and subjecting them to an extended preparation process that resulted in vellum of almost silky texture. The inks and pigments for the project were equally special. In addition to the usual black ink made from oak galls, the illuminators would use colors that had been specially imported for this commission. Ultramarine blue, made from lapis lazuli ground to an incredibly fine powder, would provide the rich blue associated with the robes of the Virgin Mary. True vermilion, made from cinnabar, would give a brilliant red that would remain unfaded for centuries. Most precious of all, sheets of gold leaf, beaten to extraordinary thinness, would provide accents that would make the finished manuscript literally shine with reflected light. Thomas spent several days working with Brother Marcus to plan the decorative program for the manuscript. They consulted pattern books that contained hundreds of design motifs collected from manuscripts throughout Europe, looking for elements that could be combined and adapted to create a coherent and beautiful whole. The major illuminations would depict the four evangelists, each shown in his traditional iconography: Matthew with his angel, Mark with his lion, Luke with his ox, and John with his eagle. The smaller decorative elements that Thomas would create were no less important to the overall effect of the manuscript. Initial letters would be decorated with intricate interlace patterns derived from Irish and Anglo-Saxon traditions, their flowing lines creating a sense of movement and energy that would draw the reader's eye into the text. Border decorations would feature stylized vines and flowers, symbolizing the abundant life that flowed from the gospel message. Marginal ornaments would include small figures of birds and animals, each chosen for its symbolic significance in Christian tradition. The work began with the careful layout of each page. Using rulers and compass, Thomas marked the margins and established guidelines that would ensure consistent spacing throughout the manuscript. The proportions had to be perfect, creating a harmonious balance between text and decoration that would please both the eye and the mind. Each page was planned individually, with the size and placement of decorative elements carefully calculated to complement the text that would surround them. As Thomas began work on his first initial letter, he was conscious of participating in a tradition that stretched back centuries. The techniques he used had been developed by generations of manuscript illuminators, refined and perfected through countless hours of patient practice. The tools he employed: brushes made from finest sable hair, quills cut to exact specifications, pigments mixed according to ancient formulas, connected him to the great chain of craftsmen who had devoted their lives to creating objects of beauty in service of the divine. The initial letter he was creating was a D that would begin the Gospel of Matthew. Following the traditional iconography, the letter would be decorated with images related to Christ's genealogy. Since Matthew's Gospel begins with the lineage of Jesus, Thomas sketched the basic form of the letter, then began to add the decorative elements: stylized trees representing the family tree of David, intertwining branches that would be painted in gold and blue, and tiny figures of important ancestors arranged along the letter's curves. The work required intense concentration and extraordinary precision. Each brushstroke had to be perfectly placed, each color mixed to exactly the right consistency. Thomas would often spend an entire morning working on an area no larger than a postage stamp, building up layers of color and detail that would create an effect of jewel-like richness and complexity. The work was demanding, but Thomas found it deeply satisfying to see beauty emerge gradually under his careful hand. Brother Francis continued to assist Thomas with simpler aspects of the work, mixing colors and preparing materials while observing the techniques used for the more complex decorative elements. The young monk's skills were developing rapidly, and Thomas increasingly trusted him with important papyri work. Francis had a natural eye for color and proportion, and Thomas believed that with proper guidance, he would eventually become a master illuminator himself. As winter progressed and the days grew shorter, the work on the bishop's manuscript continued steadily. The scriptorium took on an almost magical quality in the evening hours, when the candlelight made the gold and bright colors of the illuminations seem to glow with their own inner light. The scribes worked with quiet concentration, each absorbed in his own aspect of the great project, yet all conscious of being part of a collaborative effort that would result in something far greater than any individual contribution. The manuscript was beginning to take shape as a work of extraordinary beauty and spiritual significance. Brother David's elegant script flowed across the vellum pages in lines of perfect regularity, each letter formed with calligraphic precision. Brother Marcus's major illuminations were masterpieces of artistic achievement, combining traditional iconography with innovative decorative elements that showed his decades of experience and artistic maturity. Thomas's smaller decorations provided a perfect complement to these larger works, creating a unified visual experience that enhanced rather than competed with the sacred text. Chapter 6. The Winter Scholarly Pursuits. As the winter months settled deeply over St. Aldrich's Abbey, the rhythm of scholarly work adapted to the season's demands and opportunities. The longer evenings provided additional hours for study and reflection, while the cold weather encouraged the kind of sustained indoor work that was ideal for detailed research and writing. Thomas found this season particularly conducive to the scholarly aspects of his vocation, using the time not required for agricultural work to delve deeply into his commentary on the Psalms. The Abbey's approach to scholarship was both systematic and contemplative. Each monk who showed aptitude for learning was encouraged to develop expertise in particular areas, creating a community of specialists who could support each other's work while contributing to the overall intellectual life of the monastery. Thomas's specialty was biblical commentary, but he also had considerable knowledge of patristic literature and classical rhetoric, making him a valuable consultant for other monks working in related fields. The research methods employed by medieval scholars required patience and thoroughness. Without access to printed books or modern indexing systems, finding relevant information meant carefully reading through entire manuscripts, taking detailed notes, and gradually building up a comprehensive understanding of how different authors had treated similar topics. Thomas had developed a personal system for organizing his research, using a collection of wax tablets for temporary notes and carefully maintained parchment notebooks for information he wanted to preserve. Permanently his work on the Psalm commentary had led him into fascinating areas of study. Each psalm required analysis on multiple levels: the literal meaning of the Hebrew text, the historical circumstances of its composition, its use in Christian liturgy, and its spiritual significance for contemporary believers. This multi-layered approach meant consulting sources in several languages and from different historical periods, creating a rich tapestry of interpretation that honored both the ancient origins of the text and their continuing relevance. Thomas had recently begun collaborating with Brother Ambrose, an elderly monk who had spent decades studying Hebrew and was one of the few scholars in the region who could read the Psalms in their original language. Brother Ambrose had come to St. Aldrich's after serving as a missionary in Spain, where he had learned Hebrew from Jewish scholars who had preserved the ancient linguistic traditions. His knowledge was invaluable for understanding nuances of meaning that were lost in Latin translations. The two monks met regularly in the library during the quiet hours after Vespers, when the winter darkness provided a peaceful atmosphere for their scholarly discussions. Brother Ambrose would read passages from a Hebrew Psalter that the abbey had acquired through a complex exchange of manuscripts with a monastery in southern France, while Thomas compared the original text with various Latin versions, noting discrepancies and exploring their theological implications. "Listen to this," Brother Ambrose said one evening, his finger tracing a line of Hebrew text. "In Psalm 23, where we usually read, 'He maketh me to lie down in green pastures,' the Hebrew word for green has connotations of tender freshness, like the first grass of spring. It suggests not just abundance, but the particular kind of life that comes after winter's death." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, making notes on his wax tablet. These kinds of insights were exactly what would make his commentary valuable to other scholars. "That connects beautifully with Augustine's interpretation of the psalm as referring to spiritual renewal," he replied. "If we understand the green pastures as representing the fresh growth of grace in the soul, the imagery becomes even more powerful." Their discussions often continued long into the evening, exploring not just linguistic questions, but also the broader theological and spiritual dimensions of the psalmic texts. Brother Ambrose's experience as a missionary had given him insights into how the Psalms were understood by different Christian communities, while Thomas's broad reading in patristic literature allowed him to trace the development of interpretive traditions over several centuries. The collaborative nature of their research exemplified the ideal of monastic scholarship. Rather than competing with each other or jealously guarding their discoveries, the monks shared their knowledge freely, understanding that truth was best served by collective effort. The abbey's library was organized to facilitate this kind of collaboration, with reading desks arranged to encourage consultation between scholars and a lending system that made manuscripts available to anyone engaged in serious study. Thomas's research was also supported by an extensive correspondence with scholars at other monasteries throughout Europe. The abbey maintained regular contact with centers of learning in France, Germany, and Italy, exchanging manuscripts, sharing discoveries, and coordinating research projects that spanned multiple institutions. The winter months were ideal for this scholarly correspondence, as travel was difficult and messengers moved more slowly, giving scholars time to compose thoughtful letters that explored complex theological and philosophical questions in detail. Thomas particularly enjoyed his correspondence with Brother Benedict at the monastery of Saint Denis near Paris, a scholar who had access to manuscripts that had been copied directly from texts in the Byzantine Empire. Their letters often focused on comparing Eastern and Western interpretations of particular biblical passages, revealing fascinating differences in emphasis and understanding. These scholarly exchanges enriched the intellectual life of St. Aldrich's in ways that extended far beyond any individual research project. New ideas and methodologies would be discussed in the scriptorium, debated during the evening conversations that followed Compline, and gradually incorporated into the community's approach to learning. The Abbey's reputation as a center of scholarship continued to grow, attracting visitors who came to consult particular manuscripts or to discuss their own research with the resident scholars. The winter also provided opportunities for intensive study of the Abbey's own manuscript collection. During the agricultural seasons, much of the community's energy was devoted to the practical work of maintaining the monastery's farms and workshops. But in winter, when outdoor work was limited, more monks could devote their time to scholarly pursuits. The library became a busier place, with multiple reading desks occupied by scholars pursuing various projects. Brother Edmund's work on Easter calculation had progressed to the point where he was ready to test his mathematical models against historical records. He spent long hours comparing his predicted dates for Easter with the actual dates recorded in Abbey chronicles spanning several centuries, fine-tuning his calculations until they achieved remarkable accuracy. His work would eventually be copied and distributed to other monasteries, helping to ensure that the most important feast of the Christian calendar would be celebrated consistently throughout the Church. Chapter 7. The Art of Memory. As winter continued its gentle hold over St. Aldrich's Abbey, Brother Thomas found himself drawn into one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval learning, the art of memory. This ancient discipline, inherited from classical antiquity and adapted for Christian use, was considered essential for any serious scholar. In an age when books were precious and rare, the ability to store vast amounts of information in one's mind was not merely convenient, but absolutely necessary for scholarly work. The techniques of memory that Thomas had learned were based on principles that classical orators had developed centuries earlier. The basic method involved creating elaborate mental images and associating them with specific pieces of information, then organizing these images within imaginary architectural spaces that could be mentally walked through to retrieve the stored knowledge. For a monk like Thomas, whose work required familiarity with countless biblical passages, patristic quotations, and theological concepts, a well-trained memory was as essential as any physical tool. Thomas had begun developing his memory palace during his early years at the Abbey, following the guidance of Brother Marcus, who was renowned for his ability to recite entire books from memory. The mental structure that Thomas had created was based on the layout of a great cathedral, with different sections of the building corresponding to different categories of knowledge. The nave held his collection of biblical passages, arranged according to the order of the books in Scripture. The transepts contained patristic quotations organized by author and theme. The choir held liturgical texts and musical notations, while the various chapels around the cathedral's perimeter housed specialized knowledge, astronomical calculations, historical dates, and philosophical arguments. The process of memorizing new information required careful attention to the creation of vivid, memorable images. When Thomas encountered a particularly important passage in his reading, he would spend time creating a mental picture that would link the content to a specific location in his memory cathedral. The images had to be striking and unusual, since the human mind more easily retained information that was emotionally engaging or visually dramatic. For example, when memorizing Augustine's famous reflection on time from the Confessions, what then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I want to explain it to someone who asks, I do not know. Thomas created a mental image of Augustine himself standing at the cathedral's altar, holding an hourglass that kept changing shape in his hands, sometimes flowing like water, sometimes solid as stone. This vivid picture, placed in a specific location within his memory palace, allowed him to recall not only the exact words of the quotation, but also its context and theological significance. The discipline of memory also played a crucial role in the abbey's liturgical life. The daily cycle of prayers, hymns, and scripture readings required the monks to have extensive portions of text available for immediate recall. While written service books existed, the ideal was for the community to perform the liturgy entirely from memory, creating a more profound and spiritual experience of worship. Thomas had spent years memorizing the entire Psalter, along with hundreds of hymns, antiphons, and prayer texts that formed the backbone of monastic worship. Brother Francis, now in his 4th year at the abbey, was beginning to develop his own memory palace under Thomas's guidance. The young monk had natural talent for this kind of mental work, but he sometimes struggled with the discipline required to maintain and organize his growing collection of memorized material. Thomas encouraged him to spend time each evening reviewing and reorganizing his memory palace, ensuring that new information was properly integrated with what he had already learned. The key, Thomas explained as they walked in the abbey gardens during a brief break from their scholarly work, is to understand that memory is not passive storage, but active engagement. Each time you recall a piece of information, you should also reflect on its meaning and its connections to other knowledge. This way, your memory becomes not just a repository, but a workshop where ideas can be combined and transformed. The winter evenings provided ideal opportunities for this kind of memory work. After Compline, when formal activities had ended, Thomas would often spend time in silent review of his mental cathedral, walking through its corridors and chapels, ensuring that all the stored information remained accessible and properly organized. This was meditative work that combined intellectual discipline with spiritual reflection, since much of what he had memorized consisted of sacred texts that deepened in meaning through repeated contemplation. The art of memory also served practical purposes in Thomas's work as a scribe and illuminator. When copying manuscripts, he could draw on his memorized knowledge to check the accuracy of texts, noting discrepancies between different versions of the same work. When creating illuminations, his mental store of symbolic imagery provided inspiration for decorative elements that would enhance the meaning of the texts he was illustrating. The community's emphasis on memory reflected a broader understanding of learning that differed significantly from modern approaches. Medieval scholars believed that true knowledge required not just understanding but also possession, that information needed to be internalized and made part of one's very being before it could be properly used. This meant that scholarship was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a transformation of the whole person, a gradual process of becoming wise rather than simply becoming informed. Thomas's memory work was also enriched by the abbey's practice of Lectio Divina, the slow, contemplative reading of sacred text that was central to monastic spirituality. This practice involved reading short passages multiple times, reflecting on their meaning, and allowing them to speak to the heart as well as the mind. Through Lectio Divina, memorized texts became not just intellectual resources, but sources of spiritual nourishment that could sustain a monk through difficulties and inspire him in his daily work. Chapter 8. The Scriptorium in Springes. Winter gradually gave way to spring. The Scriptorium of St. Aldrich's Abbey underwent its own seasonal transformation. The braziers that had provided warmth during the cold months were extinguished, and the tall windows were open to admit the fresh air that carried the scents of awakening gardens and budding trees. The longer days meant that less candle work was necessary, and the scribes could take advantage of the excellent natural light that made their detailed work easier and more pleasant. Brother Thomas found the spring season particularly inspiring for his artistic work. The illuminations he created seemed to take on new life as the world outside burst into bloom, and he often incorporated elements from the abbey gardens into his decorative schemes. The manuscript of the Gospels for the bishop was nearing completion, and Thomas was working on some of the final decorative elements that would make it truly spectacular. The project had become a showcase for the collective skills of the abbey scriptorium. Brother David's text was a masterpiece of calligraphic art, with each letter formed to perfection and the lines flowing across the vellum pages with mathematical precision. Brother Marcus's major illuminations were breathtaking in their beauty and complexity, combining traditional iconography with innovative artistic elements that demonstrated his mastery of the illuminator's craft. Thomas's smaller decorations provided the perfect complement to these major works, creating a unified visual experience that enhanced every page of the manuscript. As spring progressed, the scriptorium also welcomed several visitors who had come to study the abbey's manuscript collection or to commission new works. Among these was Master Geoffrey, a scholar from the cathedral school at Chartres, who had traveled to St. Aldrich's to consult a rare commentary on Aristotle's physics that existed in only a few copies throughout Europe. Master Geoffrey's visit provided the abbey scholars with an opportunity to learn about the latest developments in natural philosophy and to discuss the controversial questions surrounding the reception of Aristotelian thought in Christian universities. The presence of visiting scholars enriched the intellectual atmosphere of the abbey in countless ways. Conversations during meals became livelier as ideas were exchanged and debated. The evening hours after Compline were filled with informal discussions that explored new perspectives on familiar texts. Most importantly, the visitors brought news of scholarly developments throughout Europe, keeping the abbey connected to the broader intellectual community, of which it was a part. Thomas particularly enjoyed his conversations with Master Geoffrey about the relationship between natural philosophy and theological truth. The cathedral schools were grappling with challenging questions about how to reconcile Aristotelian science with Christian doctrine, and these debates had implications for every aspect of scholarly work. Thomas found that his own approach to biblical commentary was enriched by understanding these broader intellectual currents. Even when his work remained focused on traditional exegetical methods, the spring season also brought new manuscripts to the scriptorium for copying and preservation. A neighboring monastery had suffered a fire that damaged part of its library, and St. Aldrich's had agreed to help by creating new copies of the most important texts that had been lost. This kind of collaborative effort was common among monasteries, reflecting the shared commitment to preserving the intellectual heritage of Christian civilization. Brother Francis had progressed to the point where he could be trusted with the copying of entire sections of these replacement manuscripts. His handwriting had developed the clarity and consistency that were essential for scholarly texts, and his understanding of Latin grammar and vocabulary had reached a level where he could detect and correct errors in his exemplars. Thomas felt considerable pride in his students' development, seeing in Francis's progress confirmation of the abbey's commitment to training the next generation of scholar monks. The work of creating replacement manuscripts also provided opportunities for innovation and improvement. When copying damaged texts, the scribes could correct obvious errors, standardize inconsistent spellings, and add marginal notes that would help future readers understand difficult passages. In this way, each new copy potentially became better than its exemplar, gradually improving the quality of the texts that would be passed on to subsequent generations. As the spring season reached its height, the Abbey gardens provided additional inspiration for the decorative work being done in the scriptorium. Thomas often walked through the gardens during breaks from his illumination work, studying the forms and colors of flowers and leaves that he would later incorporate into his artistic designs. The gardens themselves were works of art, carefully planned and lovingly maintained by Brother Paul, whose knowledge of plants was legendary throughout the region. The connection between the Abbey's gardens and its artistic work exemplified the integrated approach to life that characterized monastic culture. Beauty was not seen as separate from practical utility, nor was artistic creativity divorced from spiritual purpose. The same attention to detail and commitment to excellence that went into growing herbs for the infirmary also went into creating illuminations for sacred manuscripts. Both activities were understood as forms of service to God and the community, worthy of the highest levels of skill and dedication. Chapter 9. The Summer Harvest of Knowledge. Summer brought its own rhythm to the scholarly life of St. Aldrich's Abbey, as the longer days and warmer weather created new opportunities for learning and intellectual exchange. The season was marked by an increase in visitors to the Abbey, including scholars, pilgrims, and churchmen who came to consult the library, commission manuscripts, or simply to participate in the vibrant intellectual life of the community. Brother Thomas found the summer months particularly productive for his commentary on the Psalms. The additional daylight hours allowed him to extend his research sessions, and the warm weather made it pleasant to work in the library during the early morning and late evening hours when the light was especially beautiful. His collaboration with Brother Ambrose had yielded rich insights into the Hebrew texts, and he was beginning to synthesize this material into a coherent theological framework. The commentary was taking shape as a work that combined traditional patristic interpretation with newer insights, derived from improved understanding of the original languages. Thomas was particularly proud of his analysis of the agricultural imagery, the Psalms, which drew on his careful observation of the Abbey's farming operations as well as his scholarly research. His commentary on Psalm 1, with its famous image of the righteous man as a tree planted by streams of water, incorporated detailed knowledge of how different types of trees responded to various soil and water conditions. This integration of practical knowledge with scholarly research exemplified the holistic approach to learning that characterized monastic education. The monks of St. Aldrich's were not isolated academics, but men who combined intellectual pursuits with practical skills in agriculture, crafts, and administration. This combination gave their scholarly work a grounding in real experience that enriched their understanding of both ancient texts and contemporary applications. The summer season also brought opportunities for Thomas to share his expertise with scholars from other institutions. A delegation from the Abbey of Cluny had arrived to discuss the standardization of liturgical practices, and Thomas's knowledge of psalmic interpretation proved valuable in resolving questions about the proper understanding of certain verses used in the divine office. These kinds of scholarly collaborations helped to maintain consistency in religious practice while also advancing the frontiers of theological understanding. Brother Francis, now recognized as a fully competent scribe, had been assigned his first major independent project, creating a copy of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy for a nobleman who had contributed generously to the Abbey's building fund. This was an important milestone in the young monk's development, marking his transition from student to master craftsman. Thomas continued to provide guidance and support, but Francis was now capable of managing every aspect of the project from initial planning to final completion. The manuscript that Francis was creating demonstrated how much he had learned during his years of training. His handwriting had developed a distinctive character that combined the clarity required for scholarly texts with the elegance that made manuscripts beautiful objects in their own right. His understanding of Latin had reached a level where he could detect and correct scribal errors in his exemplar, improving the accuracy of the text he was copying. Most importantly, his artistic skills had developed to the point where he could create simple illuminations that enhanced the visual appeal of his work. The summer season was also marked by the completion of the deluxe gospel manuscript that had occupied the scriptorium for much of the year. The finished work was truly spectacular, combining the highest levels of calligraphic, artistic, and technical achievement. Brother David's text was flawless in its execution, with every letter formed to perfection and the overall layout demonstrating masterful understanding of proportion and spacing. Brother Marcus's illuminations were breathtaking in their beauty, each one a masterpiece that would have been worthy of display in any cathedral or royal court. Thomas's decorative elements provided the perfect complement to these major works, creating a unified visual experience that made every page a feast for the eyes. The presentation of the completed manuscript to the bishop was a momentous occasion for the abbey. The bishop's visit provided an opportunity to display not only this particular achievement, but also the broader scholarly and artistic capabilities of the community. Tours of the library and scriptorium allowed the episcopal delegation to see the full scope of the abbey's intellectual work, while conversations with individual monks demonstrated the depth of learning that characterized the community. The bishop's obvious delight with the manuscript provided validation for the months of careful work that had gone into its creation. His praise for the artistic achievement was gratifying, but even more important was his recognition of the spiritual significance of the work. This was not merely a beautiful object, but a vehicle for transmitting the Word of God, created with reverence and skill that honored both the sacred text and the divine source of all artistic inspiration. Chapter 10. The Wisdom of Autumn Years. As another autumn settled over St. Aldrich's Abbey, Brother Thomas found himself reflecting on the cycles of growth and harvest that characterized both the natural world and the life of learning. Now approaching his 15th year at the Abbey, he had witnessed many such seasonal transitions, each bringing its own lessons and opportunities for deepening understanding. The rhythms of monastic life, once strange and challenging, had become as natural as breathing, providing a stable framework within which intellectual and spiritual growth could flourish. The scriptorium in autumn had a particularly contemplative quality, as the golden light streaming through the tall windows seemed to illuminate not just the manuscripts on which the scribes worked, but also the deeper purposes that guided their labor. Thomas had completed his commentary on the Psalms during the summer months, and the finished work was already being copied for distribution to other monasteries throughout the region. Seeing his ideas take physical form in beautiful manuscripts gave him deep satisfaction, knowing that his scholarly work would continue to serve the Church long after his own earthly life had ended. Brother Francis, now fully established as a master scribe and illuminator, had taken on the role of training newer members of the community in the arts of the scriptorium. Thomas found great joy in watching his former student guide young monks through the same processes of discovery and skill development that he himself had experienced years earlier. The continuation of knowledge and technique from generation to generation was one of the most beautiful aspects of monastic life, ensuring that the wisdom accumulated over centuries would not be lost, but would continue to grow and develop. The Abbey's reputation as a center of learning had continued to expand, attracting scholars and students from increasingly distant places. Among the current visitors was Master William from the emerging University of Paris, who had come to study the Abbey's collection of patristic manuscripts for a comprehensive work on the development of Christian doctrine. His presence provided the community with insights into the new methods of scholarship that were being developed in the cathedral schools and universities, complementing rather than replacing the traditional approaches that had served monasticism so well. Thomas's own scholarly interests had evolved during his years at the abbey, influenced by his ongoing research and by the intellectual stimulation provided by visiting scholars and correspondence with learned men throughout Europe. While biblical commentary remained his primary focus, he had also developed considerable expertise in the history of Christian art and symbolism, drawing on his years of experience as an illuminator to understand how visual elements could convey theological meaning. This combination of practical artistic experience and scholarly research had led Thomas to begin work on a treatise about the symbolic significance of decorative elements in manuscript illumination. The work explored how different colors, patterns, and iconographic elements had been used by Christian artists to convey theological concepts, tracing the development of these symbolic languages from the early centuries of Christianity through contemporary practice. The treatise was intended not only for scholars, but also for practicing illuminators who wanted to deepen their understanding of the spiritual dimensions of their craft. The autumn season also provided opportunities for Thomas to reflect on the broader meaning of the scholarly life he had chosen. The accumulation of knowledge and the preservation of texts were valuable activities in themselves, but their ultimate purpose was the service of God and the advancement of human understanding. The manuscripts created in the scriptorium would carry forward the wisdom of the past while also contributing new insights that would enrich future generations of scholars and believers. The daily rhythms of prayer, work, and study that structured monastic life had taught Thomas that true learning required not just intellectual effort, but also spiritual discipline. The best scholarship emerged from a heart that was properly ordered toward God, approaching texts and ideas with humility, reverence, and openness to truth wherever it might be found. This integration of intellectual and spiritual development was perhaps the greatest gift that monastic life offered to those called to the scholarly vocation. As Thomas worked on his treatise about manuscript symbolism, he found himself drawing not only on his extensive reading, but also on the contemplative practices that were central to monastic spirituality. The slow, meditative approach to sacred texts that characterized Lectio Divina had trained him to see meanings and connections that might be missed by purely academic analysis. The discipline of prayer had sensitized him to the spiritual dimensions of artistic creation, helping him understand how human craftsmanship could serve as a vehicle for divine truth. The community's emphasis on collaborative learning had also shaped Thomas's approach to scholarship. Rather than viewing intellectual work as an individual pursuit aimed at personal advancement, he had learned to see it as a collective endeavor in which each scholar's contributions enriched the understanding of all. The conversations with Brother Ambrose about Hebrew texts, the collaborations with visiting scholars, and the patient teaching of younger monks had all contributed to his own intellectual development, while also advancing the broader mission of the Abbey. Chapter 11. The Circle of Seasons. As the years continued their gentle progression at St. Aldrich's Abbey, Brother Thomas had come to understand that the life of learning was itself a kind of liturgy, with its own seasons of planting and harvest, growth and reflection. His treatise on manuscript symbolism had been completed and was being copied for distribution to other centers of learning, adding to the growing body of knowledge about the spiritual dimensions of Christian art. The work had been well received by scholars throughout the region, confirming Thomas's reputation as one of the foremost authorities on the intersection of artistic practice and theological understanding. The scriptorium had undergone its own evolution during Thomas's years of service, adapting to new demands while maintaining the high standards of craftsmanship that had always characterized its work. The collection of manuscripts had grown substantially, requiring the construction of additional storage spaces and the development of more sophisticated cataloging systems. Brother Francis, now recognized as the heir apparent to Brother Marcus's position as master of the scriptorium, had introduced several innovations that improved both the efficiency and quality of the workshop's output. The training of new scribes and illuminators had become one of Thomas's primary responsibilities, and he found this teaching work deeply rewarding. Each new student brought fresh perspectives and challenges that enriched his own understanding of the craft. The process of explaining techniques and principles to novices forced him to articulate knowledge that had become so internalized that he rarely thought about it consciously, leading to new insights about the theoretical foundations of manuscript production. Among his current students was Brother Peter, a young monk who had come to the abbey with unusual artistic gifts but limited experience in scholarly work. Teaching Peter had required Thomas to develop new pedagogical approaches that could bridge the gap between intuitive artistic ability and the systematic knowledge required for serious manuscript work. The challenge had been stimulating, leading Thomas to a deeper understanding of how different types of intelligence could be integrated in the service of learning. The Abbey's correspondence network had continued to expand, connecting St. Aldrich's with scholarly communities throughout Europe and even extending to centers of learning in the Byzantine Empire. These intellectual exchanges had enriched the community's understanding of both Eastern and Western traditions of Christian scholarship, leading to new syntheses that honored the wisdom of both traditions while addressing the particular needs of contemporary religious life. Thomas's own correspondence had become quite extensive, including regular exchanges with scholars in Paris, Chartres, Canterbury, and Rome. These letters explored questions of mutual interest, shared new discoveries, and maintained the personal relationships that were so important to medieval intellectual life. The art of scholarly correspondence was itself a discipline that required skill in Latin composition, knowledge of epistolary conventions, and sensitivity to the diplomatic aspects of international communication. The seasonal rhythms that had once seemed so foreign to Thomas had become the natural framework for his life and work. Each autumn brought new projects and fresh intellectual challenges. Winter provided the contemplative atmosphere ideal for deep research and reflection. Spring offered opportunities for new collaborations and the sharing of completed work. Summer brought visitors and the chance to engage with the broader scholarly community. This cyclical pattern gave a sense of continuity and purpose to scholarly work that might otherwise seem isolated from the practical concerns of daily life. The Abbey's role in preserving and transmitting knowledge had become even more important as the pace of social and political change accelerated throughout Europe. The growth of cities, the development of universities, and the increasing complexity of ecclesiastical and secular administration all created new demands for educated personnel and scholarly resources. St. Aldrich's response to these challenges demonstrated the continued relevance of monastic learning in a changing world. In the fullness of time, Brother Thomas had become one of the senior scholars of St. Aldrich's Abbey, his hair now streaked with gray, and his hands bearing the accumulated marks of decades spent working with quill and brush. The young monk who had once struggled to form his first letters had evolved into a master craftsman whose illuminations were sought after by bishops and abbots throughout the region, and whose scholarly insights were quoted in universities from Paris to Bologna. The circle of seasons had turned many times since Thomas first entered the scriptorium as an eager novice. Each cycle had brought its own lessons and growth, its own challenges and achievements. The rhythm of monastic life, once so foreign and demanding, had become as natural as the beating of his heart, providing a framework within which both practical skills and spiritual wisdom could flourish in harmony. As Thomas sat at his familiar desk on this particular autumn evening, the golden light of sunset streaming through the tall windows, He reflected on the profound contentment that filled his days. The scriptorium around him hummed with the quiet activity of a new generation of scribes and illuminators, each pursuing their own projects with the same dedication and reverence that had guided his own work for so many years. Brother Francis, now the acknowledged master of the workshop, moved between the desks with the same gentle authority that Brother Marcus had once displayed. The young monks looked to him for guidance and inspiration, just as Thomas had once looked to his own teachers. The continuity of knowledge and tradition passed from hand to hand, from mind to mind, from heart to heart, ensured that the great work of preserving and transmitting wisdom would continue long after any individual contributor had returned to dust. The manuscripts that filled the Abbey's library represented more than mere collections of words and images. They were the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the distilled insights of countless scholars and saints, the preserved voices of those who had wrestled with the great questions of human existence and divine truth. Each carefully copied page, each lovingly crafted illumination, each precisely mixed color contributed to this vast treasury of human knowledge and spiritual understanding. Thomas's own contributions to this treasury had been modest but meaningful. His commentary on the Psalms would guide future readers in their understanding of these ancient prayers. His treatise on manuscript symbolism would help illuminators create works that conveyed not just beauty but profound theological truth. His patient teaching of younger monks had ensured that the skills and insights he had acquired would not die with him, but would continue to grow and develop in new hands and minds. The evening bell began to chime, calling the community to Compline, the final prayer service of the day. Thomas carefully cleaned his brushes and stored his pigments, performing these familiar actions with the same care and attention he had brought to them for more than 20 years. The tools of his craft had become extensions of his very being, instruments through which his devotion to God and love of beauty found their perfect expression. As he joined the procession of monks making their way to the chapel, Thomas felt the deep peace that came from a life lived in harmony with its true purpose. The work of the scriptorium would continue tomorrow, and the day after that, and for countless days to come. New scribes would take their places at the wooden desks. New illuminators would mix their colors and take up their brushes. New scholars would delve into the mysteries of ancient texts and discover fresh insights to share with the world. The chanting of Compline filled the chapel with its ancient melodies, voices rising and falling in patterns that connected this evening's prayer with countless others stretching back through the centuries. Thomas added his own voice to this timeless chorus, offering thanks for another day of meaningful work and asking for the grace to continue serving God through the gifts of mind and hand that have been entrusted to his care. The candles were extinguished one by one as the monks filed silently from the chapel, their shadows dancing on the stone walls in the flickering light. Thomas paused for a moment in the doorway, looking back at the altar where so many prayers had been offered, so many hearts had been lifted up in praise and petition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new texts to copy and new images to create, new students to teach and new insights to discover. The scriptorium would wake with the dawn, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries to come. The great work of preserving and transmitting human wisdom would continue, carried forward by faithful hands and devoted hearts, ensuring that the light of learning would never be extinguished, but would continue to shine forth into a world that would always hunger for truth and beauty and meaning. In this quiet monastery, in this peaceful valley, among these dedicated men who had chosen to spend their lives in service to something greater than themselves, the eternal conversation between past and future, between human effort and divine grace, between the written word and the living spirit, continued its gentle and profound discourse. And Brother Thomas, scribe and scholar, teacher and student, artist and monk, slept peacefully in the knowledge that he had played his part, while in this sacred endeavor that would outlast all earthly kingdoms and endure until the end of time itself. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, keeping watch over the sleeping abbey where tomorrow's work of copying and illuminating, teaching and learning would begin anew with the first light of dawn, continuing the endless cycle of seasons and years that had shaped the quiet lives of countless generations of scholar monks who had found in their humble cells and workshops a glimpse of eternal truth and perfect peace.